My friends, I want to ask you a simple question today. What are you worried about? What's been weighing heavy on your heart? You see, we all face moments in life where we don't see a way forward. We pray, we wait, and sometimes it feels like God is silent. But I want to remind you of something powerful today. Just because you can't see Him working doesn't mean He isn't. God is always ahead of you. He's already moving in ways you can't imagine. The very thing that concerns you right now, He's already working it out. The doors that seem closed, He's holding the key. The battle you feel like you're losing, He's already won it. So today, I want to encourage you, let go of fear, release the anxiety, and trust that God's plan is already in motion. He's not late, He's not distant, and He's certainly not ignoring your prayers. Sure, here's an expanded version of Keynote No. 1, written in a style that reflects faith, encouragement, and the assurance that God is always working behind the scenes. There are moments in life when it feels like nothing is happening. You pray, you wait, and yet there's no visible sign that anything is changing. The situation looks the same. The struggle feels just as difficult. The door that you've been knocking on still hasn't opened. And in those moments, doubt begins to creep in. You start wondering if God has heard you at all, if He's paying attention to your situation, or if for some reason He has decided to delay His answer. But let me tell you something today. Just because you don't see movement doesn't mean God isn't working. His plan is already in motion. Even when everything around you appears still, God is orchestrating things in the spiritual realm that your eyes cannot yet perceive. Think about how God operates. He doesn't always reveal His plan all at once. He rarely gives us a step-by-step outline of what He's doing. Why? Because if we could see the full picture, we wouldn't need faith. Faith is trusting in what we cannot see. It's believing in God's promises, even when there is no physical evidence that anything is shifting. And that's exactly what God calls us to do. Trust Him even in the silence, because He is working all things together for our good. The very thing that has been weighing on your heart, the very prayer that you have been crying out to Him, the need that you have been waiting to be met, God is not just aware of it, He is already at work bringing about His perfect will. One of the greatest examples of this is found in the life of Joseph. Here was a young man who had received a dream from God, a promise that one day he would be in a position of great authority. But what happened next? Instead of rising to prominence immediately, he was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. If anyone had a reason to doubt God's plan, it was Joseph. But what Joseph didn't know at the time was that every single hardship, every single setback was actually a step forward in God's divine plan. The betrayal moved him closer to Egypt. The false accusation positioned him for a greater opportunity. The time spent in prison led him to the very moment where he would be brought before Pharaoh. And in one divine moment, Joseph was lifted from the prison to the palace, because God had already been working behind the scenes the entire time. This is how God works in our lives as well. What looks like a setback is often a setup for something greater. What appears to be silence is actually divine preparation. God is aligning people, circumstances, and events in ways that you cannot yet comprehend. He is removing obstacles that you didn't even know were in your way. He is changing hearts, opening doors, and shifting circumstances in ways that will only make sense later. And when the time is right, when His plan has fully unfolded, you will look back and realize that every step, every delay, and even every disappointment was necessary for the fulfillment of his promise. The challenge for us is to remain steadfast in faith while we wait. The enemy wants you to believe that nothing is happening. He wants you to grow discouraged, to start doubting, to give up just before your breakthrough comes. But you must hold on to the truth that God is faithful. If he has spoken a promise over your life, it will come to pass. His word does not return void. What he has ordained for you cannot be stopped by circumstances, by people, or by the schemes of the enemy. The only thing that can hinder God's plan in your life is if you let doubt and fear take over and stop trusting him. We must learn to trust in the unseen hand of God. Think about how the seasons change. You don't see the roots of a tree growing beneath the surface, but they are. You don't see the tiny movements that push a flower to bloom, but they are happening. In the same way, you may not see what God is doing in your life, but he is working. Your job is not to figure out how or when. Your job is to trust, to keep praying, to keep walking in obedience, and to believe that God is already at work. It's to figure out how or when. Your job is to trust, to keep praying, to keep walking in obedience, and to believe that God is already at work. Because the truth is, he's never late, he's never idle, and he's certainly not ignoring your prayers. He's working all things together for your good, and in his perfect time, you will see the full picture of what he has been doing all along. Fear is one of the greatest weapons the enemy uses to keep us from walking in the fullness of God's promises. It creeps into our hearts when we focus more on the size of our problems than on the greatness of our God. It whispers lies that make us doubt God's faithfulness, convincing us that the situation is too big, the odds are too great, and the answer is too far away. But fear is never from God. Fear is the direct opposite of faith. Where faith trusts that God is in control, fear assumes that everything depends on us. Where faith says God will make a way, fear says there is no way out. And if we allow fear to take root, it will paralyze us, rob us of our peace, and keep us from moving forward in obedience. Think about how many times in the Bible God commands his people, do not fear. Over and over again, he reminds them not to be afraid because he is with them. That command is not a suggestion. It is a direct instruction. God would not tell us to do something if he had not also given us the power to obey it. He knows that fear is a natural human response, but he also knows that his presence is greater than anything we could face. That is why he repeatedly reassures his people that they are not alone, that he is fighting for them, and that the battle is already won. Consider the story of the Israelites standing before the Red Sea. They had just been delivered from slavery in Egypt, but now they found themselves trapped between the sea in front of them and Pharaoh's army behind them. In that moment, fear gripped their hearts. They thought they were doomed. They cried out in panic, questioning why God had brought them out of Egypt only to die in the wilderness. But what did Moses say to them? He spoke words of faith in the face of fear. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. And in that moment, God did what seemed impossible. He parted the Red Sea and made a way where there was no way. Fear will always try to convince you that your circumstances are bigger than your God. It will tell you that the diagnosis is final, that the financial struggle is too deep, that the relationship is beyond repair, that the mountain in front of you is too high to climb. But faith looks at those same circumstances and declares that nothing is impossible for God. Faith stands firm, even when the waters haven't parted yet, even when the breakthrough hasn't come yet, even when the answer hasn't been revealed yet. Faith chooses to believe that God is already working, even when there is no evidence of it yet. The enemy wants you to live in fear because he knows that fear keeps you from stepping into what God has for you. If he can keep you afraid, he can keep you stagnant. He can keep you stuck in cycles of doubt, worry, and anxiety, never fully trusting in God's power. But God has not given us a spirit of fear. He has given us power, love, and a sound mind. That means fear has no authority over you unless you give it permission to rule in your life. You have to make a choice. Will you live by fear or will you live by faith? Will you let your circumstances dictate your belief, or will you let God's promises shape your perspective? Think about Peter when he stepped out of the boat to walk on water. As long as his eyes were fixed on Jesus, he was doing the impossible. But the moment he shifted his focus to the wind and the waves, fear took over and he began to sink. That is exactly what happens to us. When we fix our eyes on Jesus, we walk in faith. We move forward despite uncertainty. We trust that he is in control. But when we focus on the storm around us, fear takes over, and we begin to sink into doubt, anxiety, and despair. God calls us to walk by faith, not by sight. That means we don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to see the entire plan. We don't have to understand how God is going to work everything out. We just have to trust that he is in control. We have to remind ourselves that he is the same God who parted the Red Sea, who shut the mouths of lions, who brought down the walls of Jericho, who raised the dead to life. If he did it then, he can do it now. If he was faithful before, he will be faithful again. Fear has no place in the heart of a believer who knows that God is already working on their behalf. Waiting on God's timing can be one of the most challenging aspects of faith. We live in a world that thrives on instant results, immediate answers, and quick solutions. But God does not operate on human timelines. His ways are higher than ours, and his timing is always perfect. Yet, when we find ourselves in seasons of waiting, it is easy to grow impatient, to question if God has forgotten us, or to wonder if he is even listening at all. The truth is, God is never late, never early, but always right on time. What may feel like a delay to us is actually divine preparation. What we see as waiting, God sees as working. Every moment, every second, he is aligning circumstances, refining our hearts, and ensuring that his plan unfolds exactly as it should. One of the greatest examples of God's perfect timing is the story of Abraham and Sarah. God gave Abraham a promise that he would be the father of many nations, yet years passed and Sarah remained barren. They waited and waited, and still there was no sign of the promised child. In their impatience, they took matters into their own hands, and Sarah gave her servant Hagar to Abraham, leading to the birth of Ishmael. But that was not God's promise. That was human intervention. It was years later, when all hope seemed lost, that God fulfilled his word and gave them Isaac. The delay was not a denial, it was God's perfect timing. Had they waited, they would have avoided unnecessary heartache. Their story reminds us that when we try to rush God's plan, we often create complications that were never meant to be part of the journey. But even in our mistakes, God's grace is sufficient. When God makes a promise, he does not forget it. He does not abandon what he has spoken. If he has given you a vision, a calling, or a word over your life, trust that it will come to pass at the appointed time. You may not understand the waiting, but God sees the full picture. He knows what needs to happen before he brings the promise to fulfillment. Sometimes he is preparing the circumstances. Other times, he is preparing you. There are lessons that can only be learned in the waiting. There is character that can only be built through patience. There is spiritual strength that can only develop when you trust God despite the silence. Waiting is not a waste, it is a season of growth. David was anointed as king when he was just a young shepherd boy, but he did not step into that position immediately. Instead, he went through years of trials, battles, and hardships. He was chased by Saul, forced to hide in caves, and endured seasons of uncertainty. Yet all of that was part of God's process. The waiting was molding him, shaping him into the leader that God had called him to be. Had he become king the moment he was anointed, he might not have been ready for the responsibility. God's timing was not just about placing him on the throne, it was about preparing him for the throne. And when the time was right, David stepped into his destiny, not a moment too soon or too late. Many times we become discouraged because we see others receiving their breakthroughs while we are still waiting. We wonder why God is answering their prayers but not ours. But comparison will only lead to frustration. What God has for you is for you, and no one can take what He has ordained in His perfect time. Your journey is unique. Your process is different, and your season of waiting is designed for a purpose that may not make sense right now, but one day you will look back and understand why God had you wait. The enemy will try to convince you that God's delay means He has forgotten you. He will whisper lies that say your prayers are unheard, your faith is pointless, and your waiting is in vain. But that is not the voice of truth. The voice of truth says that God is always faithful, that He is working behind the scenes, that He is aligning things in your favor. Just because you don't see immediate movement does not mean that nothing is happening. Seeds take time to grow. A foundation takes time to build. And when God is doing something significant, He often takes His time, because what He is building in your life is meant to last. The key is to trust Him, even when you don't understand, to keep believing, even when there is no visible sign, to remain faithful in prayer, in worship, in obedience, even when it feels like nothing is changing, because in due time, at the appointed hour, God will bring to pass everything He has spoken. And when He does, it will be far greater, far more beautiful, and far more perfect than anything you could have orchestrated on your own. Obedience to God is one of the most powerful keys to unlocking His blessings and walking in His divine plan. Throughout Scripture, God makes it clear that obedience is not an option for those who follow Him. It is a requirement. It is through obedience that we align ourselves with His will, position ourselves for His favor, and step into the fullness of what He has prepared for us. Often we want to see God's hand move in our lives, but we hesitate to take the steps He has asked us to take. We pray for open doors, yet we delay in following His instructions. But obedience is the bridge between God's promises and their fulfillment. When we walk in obedience, we walk in faith, trusting that even when we don't understand, even when the path is unclear, even when the command seems difficult, God knows what He is doing. Many times, obedience requires action before we see the results. When Jesus told Peter to cast his net into the water after a long night of catching nothing, it didn't make sense. Peter had already tried, he had already put in the effort, and there was no logical reason to expect a different outcome. But Peter's response was key. He said, "Because you say so, I will let down the nets." And the moment he obeyed, the miracle happened. The net became so full of fish that it nearly broke. The blessing was already waiting. It was Peter's obedience that unlocked it. In the same way, there are blessings in our lives that are waiting on the other side of obedience. God may be prompting you to take a step of faith, to let go of something that is hindering you, to trust Him with a decision, or to move in a direction that seems uncertain. But until you obey, you may not see the fullness of what He has in store. Sometimes obedience doesn't just require action, it requires endurance. There are times when God calls us to obey Him even when it is difficult, even when we don't see immediate results, even when everything in us wants to quit. Noah was instructed to build an ark when there was no sign of rain. For years he obeyed, despite the mocking, the doubts, and the long waiting period. His obedience saved not only his life, but also his entire family. Had he given up halfway through, he would have missed the fulfillment of God's plan. The same is true for us. Partial obedience is still disobedience. Delayed obedience is still disobedience. God is looking for people who will trust Him enough to obey fully, to remain faithful, and to follow His voice even when it doesn't make sense. One of the greatest obstacles to obedience is fear. We hesitate because we don't know what's ahead. We fear failure, rejection, discomfort, or the unknown. But obedience requires trust. When God called Abraham to leave his home and go to a land He would show him, Abraham didn't have all the details. He didn't have a roadmap, but he obeyed because he trusted the one who was leading him. And because of his obedience, God made him the father of many nations. If we allow fear to dictate our decisions, we will always find reasons to hesitate. But if we choose to trust that God is for us, that He knows what is best, and that He is faithful to His promises, then we can step forward in obedience without fear. Another challenge to obedience is the temptation to compromise. There are times when we try to negotiate with God, to obey partially or to hold on to things He has asked us to release. But obedience is not about doing things our way. It is about surrendering to His way. Saul lost his kingship because he chose to obey God halfway. Instead of completely destroying what God had commanded him to, he kept part of it for himself. And when confronted, he justified his actions rather than repenting. But God is not looking for excuses. He is looking for hearts that are fully surrendered. When He asks us to lay something down, it is because He has something greater in store. When He asks us to move in a certain direction, it is because He is leading us into His best. Compromise may feel easier in the moment, but it will always cost us more in the long run. True obedience requires full surrender. Obedience is not just about the big decisions. It is about the daily choices we make. It is about listening to His voice in the small moments, being faithful in the little things, and honoring Him with our actions, even when no one is watching. Every act of obedience builds our faith. Every step we take in alignment with His will strengthens our trust in Him. The more we obey, the more we see His hand at work. The more we trust, the more we experience His faithfulness. Obedience is not always easy, but it is always worth it. God's blessings, His provision, and His guidance are always connected to our willingness to follow Him wholeheartedly. Faith is not just believing that God exists. It is trusting Him completely, even when circumstances seem impossible. It is standing firm in His promises when everything around you suggests otherwise. Faith is what moves mountains, what opens doors, and what allows us to experience the fullness of God's power in our lives. But faith is not always easy. It requires us to let go of our need for control, to trust in God's unseen hand, and to move forward even when we cannot see the next step. Faith is what allows us to walk through storms with confidence, knowing that God is already working things out for our good. It is what keeps us standing when life throws its hardest battles our way.